Ambassador Kethvaran of the Hegemony Council stood before the assembled delegates of 47 spacefaring civilizations, his iridescent scales flickering with barely contained amusement. The holographic display behind him showed a small blue world spinning in the darkness of an unremarkable spiral arm, Earth, as its inhabitants called it. And so, Kethvaran continued, his mandibles clicking in the Thoraxian equivalent of laughter, the humans actually believe that their deceased warriors are taken to something called Valhalla, where they feast and fight for eternity. They think their souls persist beyond biological termination. The chamber erupted in what could only be described as cosmic mockery. The crystalline Selenari tinkled their amusement. The gas giant dwelling Nephulans rumbled with mirth. Even the usually stoic Arboran delegation rustled their fronds in what passed for hysterics among their kind. Commander Nathan Cole watched the transmission from his post aboard the reconnaissance vessel Distant Horizon, his jaw tightening with each passing second. Beside him, Lieutenant Amanda Price gripped the armrest of her station until her knuckles went white. The bridge crew remained silent, each officer processing what they were witnessing in their own way. Some looked angry, others looked afraid. A few looked thoughtful, as if calculating odds that no rational mind would want to contemplate. "They've been broadcasting this for hours," Amanda said quietly. "Every frequency, they want us to hear it." Nathan nodded slowly. "They think we're primitives, amusing curiosities to be studied before they decide what to do with us." The transmission continued. Kethvaran was now showing images of ancient human temples, of churches and mosques, of shrines and sacred groves. They build structures dedicated to invisible beings they call gods. They believe these entities created the universe and take personal interest in their individual lives. The psychological delusion is fascinating from an anthropological perspective. More laughter. A delegate from the Machini Collective, synthetic beings who had transcended organic existence millennia ago, offered what it considered a charitable interpretation. Perhaps their neural architecture is simply too limited to process the fundamental meaninglessness of existence. It is a common developmental phase. The Selenari representative added her own observation, her crystalline voice ringing through the chamber like wind chimes in a storm. "They have hundreds of different belief systems, many of which contradict each other. Yet they maintain these beliefs with remarkable tenacity, even going to war over the specific details of which imaginary being deserves worship." "Sir," Ensign Danny Morrison spoke up from the communications station, his voice tight. "I'm picking up another transmission. It's coming from the Hegemony flagship." Nathan turned. "Put it through." The main view screen flickered and a new face appeared, if it could be called a face. This was High Admiral Korath of the Unified Hegemony Fleet, a being whose species had evolved in the crushing depths of a world 3 times Earth's gravity. His form was squat and armored, his eyes set deep in protective ridges of bone and cardite. The weight of his authority was evident in every aspect of his bearing. "Human vessel," Korath said, his voice translated through the ship's systems into something approximating human speech. "Your species has been observed and evaluated. Your technological level is approximately 2,000 cycles behind standard hegemony development. Your military capabilities are negligible. Your planetary defenses are inadequate to resist even a minor pacification force." Nathan stood slowly, aware of the weight of his crew's attention. This moment had been anticipated for years, ever since the first hegemony scout ships had been detected at the edge of the solar system. Plans had been made, preparations had been undertaken. And yet, standing here now, facing the reality of first contact with a hostile superior civilization, he felt the ancient human fear of the unknown stirring in his chest. "And what do you intend to do with that information, Admiral?" Korath's mouth twisted in what might have been a smile. "The hegemony has decided that your world will make an excellent addition to our resource extraction network. Your population will be relocated to more suitable facilities. Your planetary defenses will be dismantled. Your ships will be decommissioned. Your planet will be efficiently harvested for the benefit of more advanced civilizations. And if we resist, then we will destroy you completely, efficiently, without the slightest difficulty." Korath leaned forward, his deep-set eyes gleaming with absolute certainty. But I am curious, human. What are these myths your species clings to? What stories do you tell yourselves in the darkness? Tell me of your gods before we erase you from the cosmos. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. On the bridge around him, his crew waited in tense silence. Amanda had her hand near the emergency protocols, ready to initiate them at his command. Danny was recording everything, ensuring that whatever happened next would be preserved for whatever survivors might remain. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. You want to know about our myths? Consider it academic interest. A final kindness before your extinction. Nathan nodded slowly. All right, I'll tell you a story. Once a very long time ago, my people lived in small groups. We were prey animals, Admiral. We had no claws, no armor, no venom. We couldn't fly, couldn't swim particularly well, couldn't see in the dark. By all rights, we should have been extinct before we ever developed fire. And yet you survived, Korath said, sounding bored. Through luck or favorable conditions, it matters little. No, Nathan said. We survived because we told stories. We looked at the darkness and the things that hunted us, and we created myths. We made gods in our image, beings who fought against the chaos, who loved us, who died for us. We created heroes who faced impossible odds and won through courage and sacrifice. We told ourselves that we mattered, that our struggle meant something. Delusions, Korath said. Perhaps, but those delusions made us dangerous. Nathan's voice hardened, and there was something ancient in his tone now, something that belonged to torch-lit caves and huddled tribes. We told ourselves that the strong must protect the weak. That honor means fighting even when you can't win, that there are things worth dying for. We built entire civilizations around those stories, Admiral. We went to war over them. We reshaped our world because of them. You speak as if these stories gave you some advantage, Korath said. Yet your weapons are primitive. Your ships are slow. You have no orbital defenses worth mentioning. That's true, Nathan admitted. We are outmatched. Technologically, militarily, we don't stand a chance against the hegemony. He paused, letting the admission hang in the air. But let me tell you something about human myths, Admiral. The stories we tell ourselves, they have a way of becoming true. Before Korath could respond, Nathan continued. Centuries ago, when we first started reaching toward the stars, we wondered if we were alone. Some hoped we would find friends out there. Others feared we would find enemies. But there was another group, people who believed that the universe was dangerous beyond imagining, and that humanity needed to prepare for the worst. Your species has no preparation adequate for. They were called the Pantheon Project, Nathan said, speaking over him with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what cards he holds. Named after the temples where humans once worshipped their gods. They were dreamers and scientists, engineers and true believers. They looked at our myths, all of them, from every culture, and they asked the question, what if the stories were blueprints? Amanda was staring at him now, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning understanding. She had been briefed on some aspects of the Pantheon Project, but not all, not nearly all. What if Valhalla wasn't just a story about warriors in the afterlife? Nathan continued. What if it was a design specification, a place where the fallen could be preserved, rebuilt, restored to fight again? What if the gods weren't metaphors for natural forces but descriptions of what we could become? Korath's expression had changed. The boredom was gone, replaced by something else, not quite concern but a new attentiveness. You speak in riddles, human. Do I? Nathan smiled, and there was something ancient in that expression. Something that belonged to flickering firelight and cave paintings, and the first moment when a human looked at a wolf and saw a dog. The Pantheon Project has been active for 300 years, Admiral. 3 centuries of the brightest minds humanity ever produced, working in secret, taking our myths and making them real. He touched a control on his chair's armrest. Allow me to introduce you to a few of them. The space around the distant horizon began to shimmer. At first, it seemed like sensor interference, a static distortion in the fabric of space-time. But then the distortions resolved into shapes, ships, massive ships, warships of a design that belonged to no known civilization. They emerged from what the sensors could only describe as folds in reality, spaces between spaces that shouldn't have existed. First one, then 10, then 100, then 1,000. then more. 10,000 dreadnoughts materialized in perfect formation around the tiny reconnaissance vessel, their hulls gleaming with materials that defied spectral analysis, their weapon systems generating energy signatures that made the hegemony's most powerful vessels look like toys. The Einherjar fleet, Nathan said quietly, named for the warriors of Valhalla, every ship crewed by men and women who died in service to humanity and were restored to fight again. Their minds preserved at the moment of death, their bodies rebuilt, their dedication to protecting their species absolute. On the hegemony flagship, alarms were screaming. Korath was shouting orders, his command staff scrambling to make sense of what their sensors were telling them. Data streamed across their displays, mass readings that couldn't be accurate, energy signatures that violated known physics, weapon system projections that their tactical computers simply refused to process. "That's impossible," he snarled. "That technology, the energy required to do what you're describing. We also built Prometheus," Nathan said. "Not a titan who stole fire from the gods, but a zero-point energy extraction system that draws power from the quantum vacuum itself. Infinite energy, Admiral. Enough to power an entire civilization's worth of ships. Enough to bend space and time." Another shimmer, and more ships appeared, smaller vessels, sleek and fast, crackling with energy that seemed to dance along their hulls like living lightning. The Valkyries, ships that can identify and retrieve any human consciousness at the moment of death, anywhere in the galaxy. They watch over every soldier, every pilot, every brave soul who puts themselves in harm's way for their species. When they fall, the Valkyries carry them to Valhalla to be restored and returned to duty. Korath's face had gone pale, or whatever passed for pale among his species. His thick fingers gripped the arms of his command chair so tightly that his own armor began to crack. "This is a trick, an illusion. You wanted to know about our myths," Nathan said. "Let me tell you about a few more. Mjolnir, not a hammer wielded by a thunder god, but a weapons system capable of directing lightning bolts of pure plasma across interstellar distances. Excalibur, a cutting-edge technology that can slice through any known material, including the quantum-reinforced armor your flagships use. Aegis, a shield system that can protect an entire planet from bombardment." As he spoke, the dreadnoughts began to move. They didn't accelerate in any conventional sense. They simply were in one place, and then they were in another, as if the concept of distance had decided to make an exception for them. "How?" Korath managed. "You've only had faster-than-light capability for less than a century. You should be thousands of years from this level of development." "We cheated," Nathan said simply. "Another very human trait. When the rules make winning impossible, we change the rules." He stood, walking toward the viewscreen as if he could step through it and face Korath directly. The Pantheon project wasn't just about building weapons. It was about understanding the fundamental nature of reality and reshaping it according to our myths. It turns out the universe is more malleable than anyone realized, if you have enough imagination and determination. "You speak of impossibilities," Korath said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Our myths are full of impossibilities," Nathan agreed. "Gods who create worlds with words, heroes who descend to the underworld and return, mortals who become immortal through their deeds. We never accepted that impossible meant impossible. We just saw it as a challenge." The Einherjar fleet had finished its deployment. 10,000 dreadnoughts now surrounded not just the distant horizon, but the entire hegemony diplomatic armada, 200 vessels that had seemed so overwhelming just moments ago. "Here is what will happen now," Nathan said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You will return to your council and tell them what you have seen. You will explain that humanity is no longer a primitive species to be harvested. You will make it very clear that any hostile action against Earth or its people will result in consequences that your civilizations cannot survive." "You threaten the entire hegemony?" Korath asked, his voice rising. 47 species, billions of worlds." "I threaten no one," Nathan said. "I inform you of reality. We didn't build this fleet to conquer. We built it to protect ourselves because that's what our myths teach us to do. Protect your people, fight the monsters, stand against the darkness." He paused, letting the words sink in. But make no mistake, if you come for Earth, if you try to harvest our world or enslave our people, you will face the full force of human mythology made manifest. And Admiral, we have a lot of myths. Some of them are much darker than Valhalla. The silence stretched for a long moment. Korath's eyes moved from the view screen to his tactical displays, taking in the impossible reality of what surrounded his fleet. "This changes nothing," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "The hegemony will not be intimidated by." "By what?" Nathan asked. "By a species that looked at the universe and decided to remake it in the image of their dreams. By people who refused to accept that they were small and insignificant. By a civilization that turned its stories into reality." Smiled again, and this time there was warmth in it alongside the steel. "We're not asking you to be intimidated, Admiral. We're asking you to understand. Humanity doesn't want war with the hegemony. We don't want to destroy your civilizations or conquer your worlds. We just want to live, to explore, to grow, and to be left in peace to do so. And if we refuse, then you will learn why our ancestors feared the dark," Nathan said quietly, "and why they told stories to keep the fear at bay. Those stories made us who we are, Admiral. They made us dreamers and builders and fighters. They made us capable of things that no rational species would ever attempt." He gestured at the fleet surrounding them. "This is what happens when you give a species of storytellers 300 years to prepare for first contact. This is what happens when myths become engineering specifications. This is what happens when gods are not worshipped but built." Korath was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different, thoughtful, almost respectful. "Your species is insane." "Probably," Nathan agreed, "but functional insanity is another very human trait. We call it faith." The High Admiral made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely. "I will report to the Council. I will tell them what I have seen, but I make no promises about their response." "That's all we ask," Nathan said. "A chance to be heard. A chance to prove that we can be allies instead of enemies." The transmission ended. In the chamber where the Hegemony Council had been laughing at human myths, there was now dead silence. The holographic display still showed Earth, but now it also showed the thousands of dreadnoughts that had appeared from nowhere, and the energy readings that defied every known law of physics. Ambassador Kethvaren's scales had gone from iridescent to a dull gray, a sign of extreme distress among his species. "What have we done?" he whispered. "What have we awakened?" No one had an answer. 3 months later, humanity's formal request for diplomatic relations was approved by the Hegemony Council. The vote was unanimous. The story could have ended there, should have ended there perhaps, with humanity taking its place among the stars, respected and feared in equal measure. But stories, like the species that tell them, have a way of growing beyond their original boundaries. The first year of formal relations was tense but productive. Human ambassadors, selected as much for their knowledge of mythology as their diplomatic skills, began the slow process of establishing trust with the hegemony's member species. Trade agreements were negotiated. Cultural exchanges were arranged. Scientists from both sides began the careful work of sharing knowledge. But not everyone in the galaxy was pleased with humanity's sudden elevation. The hegemony was not a monolithic entity. It was an alliance of convenience, held together by mutual self-interest and the understanding that cooperation was more efficient than conflict. Some species had grown wealthy from the exploitation of less developed civilizations. Some had built their entire economies around the harvesting of primitive worlds. Lord Verk of the Dominion Syndicate was one such individual. His species, the Korthani, had risen to prominence through ruthless efficiency and a complete absence of what humans would call conscience. They dealt in resources, all kinds of resources, including the biological variety. The labor camps on their mining worlds were legendary for their brutality and their profitability. Earth had been on Verk's list for decades. A world rich in minerals, water, and most importantly, a large population of moderately intelligent bipeds who could be put to work in the extraction operations. The revelation of humanity's hidden fleet had been a personal disaster. 10,000 ships, he said, staring at the tactical projections in his private command center, appearing from nowhere. using technology we cannot understand, let alone replicate. His advisor, a thin Korthani named Sedek, nodded carefully. The analysis teams have been studying the sensor data for months, Lord Verk. They cannot explain how the humans achieved this. 300 years, Verk mused. They've only had interstellar capability for less than a century, yet they claim to have been building this fleet for 300 years. Either they're lying about their development timeline or they're lying about the fleet. Which do you believe, Lord? Verk's eyes, small and calculating, and his scaled face narrowed. Neither. I believe they're telling the truth about both, which means we're missing something fundamental about how they accomplished this. And what we don't understand, we cannot counter. He turned to face the display showing Earth, the blue marble that had so recently become the most dangerous world in the galaxy. Find out how they did it. Use whatever resources necessary. Bribe their people. Infiltrate their systems. Do whatever it takes. I want to know everything about this Pantheon project. What Verk didn't understand, what none of the hegemony species could have understood, was that the Pantheon project hadn't just built weapons. It had built watchers. Systems that monitored every communication, every data transfer, every whisper of information that concerned humanity's security. The moment his orders were transmitted, they were intercepted, analyzed, and flagged for human attention. Catherine Lopez received the alert in her office at Pantheon Central, a facility hidden in the deep crust of Earth, where the most sensitive operations were coordinated. She was 34 years old, with dark hair and the kind of calm intensity that came from years of training and purpose. Her official title was Director of External Threat Assessment. Her unofficial role was something more fundamental. She was one of the Guardians, individuals enhanced by Pantheon technology to serve as humanity's first line of defense. Sedek to Commander Verk, she read aloud from the intercepted message. Analysis teams have been unable to determine the source of human technological advancement. Recommend direct infiltration of their primary research facilities. She looked up at the man standing across from her desk. Benjamin Hardy was older, his hair gray at the temples, but his eyes were sharp and alert. He had been one of the original Pantheon scientists, back when the project was nothing more than a dream and a handful of theoretical papers. They're going to try to steal our secrets, Catherine said. We knew this would happen eventually. Benjamin nodded. The question is how we respond. We could simply let our defenses handle it. The security systems will catch any infiltration attempt before it gets anywhere near sensitive data, but that doesn't address the underlying problem. Which is fear, he said simply. The hegemony species are afraid of us now. That fear will make some of them cautious, but it will drive others to desperate action. Verk is just the first. There will be others. Catherine leaned back in her chair, considering the implications. What do you recommend? Something we should have done from the beginning, Benjamin said. Tell them the truth, all of it. She raised an eyebrow. You want to reveal the full extent of the Pantheon project, the real scope of what we've built. I want to reveal the philosophy behind it, Benjamin corrected. The technology is just an expression of something deeper, something that might actually reach them if they're willing to listen. Catherine considered this for a long moment. That's a significant risk. If they understand how we think, they might find ways to counter us. Or they might understand that we're not actually a threat to them, Benjamin said. The hegemony has spent millennia operating on the assumption that strength equals aggression, that any civilization with power will inevitably use it to dominate others. We're different. We need to show them why. The decision was made at a level far above Catherine's position, but the plan that emerged reflected Benjamin's insight. Humanity would host a summit, not of politicians or military leaders, but of storytellers. The greatest writers, artists, and mythmakers from every hegemony species would be invited to Earth to participate in a cultural exchange, unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The event was called the First Congress of Narrative Minds, and it drew delegates from 32 species, including some who had never sent representatives to any human event. For 3 weeks, they gathered in a purpose-built facility in what had once been called Arizona, surrounded by the red rock monuments that had inspired human stories for thousands of years. The Selinari delegate was named Krista Voice of Mourning, and she found herself sitting across from a human woman named Grace Sullivan on the third day of the Congress. Grace was 87 years old, a novelist who had spent her life writing stories about hope in the face of darkness, about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage. "You must understand," Krista said, her crystalline body catching the light as she spoke. "Among my people, narrative serves a different function. We do not tell stories to inspire or comfort. We tell them to record, to create perfect memories that can be shared across generations. A story is a fact, not a feeling." Grace smiled. "And yet you came here. You were curious about how humans use stories." "I was curious about the paradox," Krista admitted. "Your species achieved technological impossibilities by believing in obvious untruths. This contradicts everything we understand about the relationship between knowledge and progress." "Does it?" Grace asked. "Tell me, Krista, when your people develop new technologies, what drives them? What makes a Selinari scientist spend their life pursuing answers they may never find?" Krista considered the question carefully. "The desire to know, to understand, to add to the collective repository of Selinari knowledge. And where does that desire come from?" The question seemed to catch Krista off guard. "It is fundamental, a basic characteristic of intelligence." "Is it?" Grace pressed gently. "Among humans, we call it wonder. The sense that the universe is vast and mysterious and worth exploring. We feel it most strongly when we look at the stars and ask ourselves what might be out there. And you know what? That feeling, that wonder, it's very similar to how we feel when we hear a good story, when we imagine possibilities we've never considered before." She leaned forward. "The Pantheon Project didn't succeed because humans are smarter than other species or because we had some technological advantage. Succeeded because we've spent 100,000 years training ourselves to believe in impossible things. Every child who ever played pretend, every adult who ever read a book and felt transported to another world, every person who ever looked at the night sky and dreamed of touching the stars, they were all practicing the fundamental skill that made everything else possible. The skill of imagination," Krista said slowly. "The skill of faith," Grace corrected. "Imagination shows you what might be possible. Faith gives you the courage to try and make it real." Similar conversations were happening across the Congress. Human storytellers and hegemony delegates finding common ground through the universal language of narrative. The breakthrough came on the final day, when a human playwright named Marcus Rivers presented a piece that would be remembered for centuries. The play was called The Bridge, and it told the story of two civilizations, one ancient and powerful, one young and struggling, that found themselves on the brink of war. The powerful civilization could not understand why the younger one refused to simply surrender to the inevitable. The younger civilization could not understand why the older one demanded submission rather than cooperation. What made the play revolutionary was its structure. It was written to be performed simultaneously by human and hegemony actors, with the dialogue designed so that each species heard it differently based on their own cultural references. The same words meant different things to different minds, and yet somehow, impossibly, the story remained coherent. The climax came when the two civilizations finally understood each other, not through translation or negotiation, but through shared recognition of something deeper. They were both, in their own ways, telling stories about the same fundamental things: the desire to survive, to grow, to leave something behind that would outlast them. They were both trying to find meaning in a universe that offered none automatically. When the lights came up, there was silence in the theater. Then slowly, something remarkable happened. The Selinari delegation began to sing, a haunting, crystalline melody that had no words but somehow communicated perfectly. The Nephulans added a deep, rumbling harmony. Even the Machini, who claimed to have transcended emotion, contributed a precise and beautiful counterpoint. The humans joined in, adding their voices to the cosmic chorus. For one perfect moment, 32 species sang together in a language that none of them had known they shared. Lord Verk watched the recordings of the Congress from his command center, his face unreadable. His infiltration attempts had all failed, not through any dramatic intervention but through simple disinterest. The humans hadn't bothered to stop his agents because they hadn't cared what he learned. The Pantheon project was beyond him, not because its secrets were well guarded, but because its fundamental premise was something his mind couldn't process. "They're offering to share it," Sedek said quietly. "The technology, the philosophy, everything. They've released detailed documentation on the theoretical framework underlying the Einherjar fleet. Any species can study it." "A trick," Verk said automatically. "They want us to become dependent on their technology so they can control us." "I don't think so, Lord." Sedek hesitated, then continued. "I've been studying the human approach. They don't think like we do. They don't see advancement as a zero-sum game where one species' gain is another's loss. They genuinely believe that sharing their achievements will make the entire galaxy stronger. And what happens when the galaxy becomes stronger than them?" Sedek was quiet for a moment. "Then they will be proud, Lord. They will see it as proof that their myths, their stories were right all along, that cooperation is better than competition, that helping others is its own reward." Verk stared at the display, at the footage of the Congress, at the image of 32 species singing together. "Insanity," he whispered. "Complete and total insanity." "Perhaps," Sedek agreed. "But functional insanity, Lord, very functional indeed." The changes came slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The principles underlying the Pantheon project, what the humans called mythopoetic engineering, began to spread through the hegemony's scientific community. Not everyone could make use of them. The approach required a certain kind of thinking that many species found difficult or impossible to adopt. But enough researchers caught the spark that progress began to accelerate. The Selenari developed their own version of the approach, creating what they called memory ships, vessels that could record and preserve the experiences of their crews, creating perfect narratives of their journeys through space. The Nephulans, inspired by human stories of sea monsters and deep ocean mysteries, designed exploration craft that could descend into the crushing pressures of gas giant cores and return with samples never before obtained. Even the Machini, for all their claims of transcendence, found something in the human approach that resonated with their core programming. They began incorporating elements of uncertainty and imagination into their decision-making algorithms, and found that the results were often superior to pure logic alone. Nathan Cole watched these developments from his new position as Earth's ambassador to the Hegemony Council. It had been 5 years since the confrontation with Korath, and the galaxy had changed in ways he could never have predicted. "You seem troubled," a voice said beside him. He turned to find Ambassador Kethvarin, the same diplomat who had once laughed at human myths on a galactic broadcast. "Not troubled," Nathan said, "just wondering." "About what?" "Whether any of us understood what we were starting," Nathan admitted. "When the Pantheon project was conceived, we just wanted to protect ourselves, to make sure humanity couldn't be wiped out by a more advanced civilization. We never imagined we'd end up changing the entire galaxy." Kethvarin's scales flickered in what Nathan had learned to recognize as thoughtfulness. "You gave us something we didn't know we were missing, a new way of looking at existence, a reason to believe that the universe has meaning beyond mere survival. And you're not afraid of what that might lead to." "Terrified," Kethvarin said cheerfully. "But that's rather the point, isn't it? Your species taught us that fear isn't something to be avoided, it's something to be faced, embraced even. Used as fuel for greater achievements." He made the Thoraxian equivalent of a smile. "Before humans, we Thoraxians had no stories worth telling. We recorded facts, we analyzed data, we optimized processes. Our entire civilization was efficient, logical, and utterly without meaning beyond continued existence. And now we are learning to dream," Kethvarin said. "It is strange and uncomfortable and sometimes painful, but it is also wonderful in ways I cannot fully describe. We are becoming something more than we were, thanks to you." Nathan nodded slowly. "The Pantheon scientists used to say that myths are just reality waiting to be born. Maybe they were right about more than they knew." The two ambassadors stood together in silence, watching the stars through the observation window of the council chamber. Somewhere out there, the Einher, our fleet still patrolled, still watched, still stood ready to defend humanity against any threat. but increasingly there were no threats to defend against. The galaxy was changing, one story at a time. Catherine Lopez visited Benjamin Hardy on the anniversary of the first Congress of Narrative Minds. He was 93 now, his body frail but his mind still sharp. They sat together in his garden, surrounded by flowers he had grown from seeds brought back by exploration missions to a dozen different worlds. "Did you ever think it would work?" she asked. "When you first proposed the Pantheon project, did you really believe we could change the galaxy?" Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, watching a bee move from flower to flower. "I believed we could protect ourselves," he said finally. "I believed that if we put everything we had into our myths, our hopes and dreams and fears, we might be strong enough to survive whatever was waiting out there." "But this is more than survival," Catherine said. "The hegemony is transforming. Species that were enemies for millennia are working together. The whole structure of galactic civilization is shifting." "Yes," Benjamin agreed, "because the one thing I didn't account for was how hungry everyone was for meaning. We built the Einher, our fleet, to defend humanity, but what we really created was proof that stories matter, that imagination has power, that the things we believe can become the things we achieve." He turned to look at her, his eyes bright despite his age. "The galaxy laughed at our myths because they thought we were deluding ourselves. They didn't understand that the delusion was the point. Humans have always known, deep down, that reality is what we make it. We just finally had the courage to make it explicitly." Catherine thought about the reports she'd received that morning. The machine had announced a breakthrough in consciousness theory, based on human concepts of the soul. The Arborean Collective was experimenting with something they called world dreams, entire forests that shared a single evolving narrative. Even the Korthani Verks people were beginning to change, abandoning their exploitation-based economy in favor of something more cooperative. "We're living in a story," she said slowly. "A story about how stories changed everything." Benjamin smiled. "The best kind of story, one that's still being written." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the alien flowers bloom in the Earth's sunlight. Somewhere above them, 10,000 dreadnoughts stood watch, crewed by warriors who had died and been reborn, protecting a species that had survived by believing in impossible things. The galaxy had laughed at human myths, and then the myths had saved them all. In the archives of the Pantheon project, buried deep in the facility where Catherine worked, there was a document that very few people had ever seen. It was written by hand on paper, in the careful script of a young woman who had lived and died centuries before the project was ever conceived. Her name was Elizabeth, and she had been a storyteller in a time when human survival was far from certain. Her people had faced extinction more than once, from disease, from famine, from war. She had watched friends die and villages burn. She had known despair in its purest form, and yet somehow she had kept writing stories. The document was her final work, completed just days before her own death from a fever that swept through her community. It was a story about the future, about a time when humanity would reach the stars and find challenges beyond imagining. It was a story about fear and courage, about darkness and light, about the power of belief to reshape reality. The final lines read, "And when they laugh at us for dreaming, when they mock our hopes and dismiss our faith, we will smile and continue dreaming. For dreams are the seeds of tomorrow, and those who tend them with love and dedication will harvest miracles beyond measure." The Pantheon scientists had found the document centuries later, preserved by chance in a forgotten archive. They had taken Elizabeth's words as their motto, their inspiration, their guiding light. They had built an entire civilization's worth of impossible technologies as a tribute to a young woman who had believed in the power of stories. Elizabeth had never learned to read, never traveled more than a few miles from the place where she was born, never imagined that her words would reach across centuries to change the fate of countless worlds. She was nobody special, just another human being trying to make sense of a harsh and unforgiving universe. But she had told stories, and in the end, that had been enough. The galaxy was learning what humans had always known, that the universe is not a cold and meaningless place, but a canvas waiting to be painted with the colors of imagination. The myths were not delusions, they were blueprints. The gods were not fantasies, they were potential. The heroes were not fictions, they were possibilities. Nathan Cole stood before the Hegemony Council one final time, his hair gray now, his body showing the weight of decades spent building bridges between species. The chamber was full, not with skeptical observers waiting to mock human primitiveness, but with allies, partners, friends. "I came before this body once to warn you," he said, his voice still strong despite his age, "to tell you that humanity would not be exploited or destroyed, that our myths had given us the power to protect ourselves." He paused, looking around at the assembled delegates. "I was wrong. I told you only half the story." The chamber was silent, attentive. "Our myths did give us power, but not the power to dominate or control, the power to imagine better futures, the power to believe that cooperation could triumph over competition, the power to see ourselves as part of something larger than any single species or world." He smiled. "When the Einerjar fleet appeared, you saw 10,000 warships ready to destroy anyone who threatened us. What you should have seen was 10,000 examples of human dedication to protecting what we love. Every crew member on those ships died defending their families, their communities, their species, and every one of them chose to come back to keep serving, to keep protecting." He spread his arms wide. "That's what our myths taught us, not how to build weapons, but why to build them, not how to fight wars, but why to prevent them, not how to survive, but why survival matters." Nathan's voice dropped lower. "The galaxy didn't change because humans had superior technology. It changed because we offered something everyone was searching for but didn't know how to find: meaning, purpose. The sense that existence is not just an accident but an opportunity." He looked at Kethvarin, at the Selenari delegates, at representatives of species he had fought against, and species he had never met before the hegemony made contact with Earth. All of them different, all of them unique, all of them part of the same vast and wonderful story. "This is our final gift to you," Nathan said. "The understanding that every species, every individual, every moment of consciousness is a storyteller. The universe is waiting for you to tell it what you want it to be. And if you believe hard enough, if you work hard enough, if you dream hard enough, it will become what you imagine." He stepped back from the podium. "Thank you for listening to our myths. Thank you for letting them change you. Thank you for becoming part of the story." Applause began slowly, then built into something that shook the chamber walls. 47 species, united not by fear or force but by shared wonder at what existence could become. The galaxy had laughed at human myths. Then 10,000 dreadnoughts had appeared above them, but in the end it wasn't the dreadnoughts that changed everything. It was what they represented, the unshakable human conviction that reality is what we choose to make it. The myths had become real, and the story was only beginning. Years passed, decades. The galaxy continued to transform in ways both subtle and profound. The hegemony itself evolved, shedding its old structures of dominance and exploitation in favor of something more collaborative. New species were discovered and welcomed not as resources to be harvested, but as potential storytellers with their own myths to share. The Einerjar fleet remained on patrol, its eternal crews watching over the civilization they had died to protect. But they found themselves with less and less to do as the galaxy learned the lessons humanity had been teaching. Wars became rare, then rarer still. Conflicts that once would have been settled through annihilation were resolved through narrative, through finding the shared stories that connected opposing sides. Catherine Lopez eventually took over leadership of the Pantheon project itself, guiding its evolution from a defensive program into something more ambitious. Under her direction, the project began working on its greatest achievement yet, a universal translator of myths. A system that could take any story from any species and find its equivalent in every other culture. A technology for understanding. When it was complete, the galaxy celebrated. For the first time in recorded history, every intelligent species could truly comprehend every other. Not just their words, but their dreams. Not just their facts, but their faiths. The barriers that had separated civilizations since the dawn of time were falling, one story at a time. And somewhere, in a garden on Earth, an old man named Benjamin Hardy closed his eyes for the last time, a smile on his face. He had lived to see his dream become reality. He had watched humanity go from prey animals huddled around fires to storytellers reshaping the cosmos. The Valkyries found him there, his consciousness preserved in the instant of his passing, ready to be restored if he chose to continue his work. But Benjamin Hardy had written his final chapter. His story was complete. The galaxy would remember him, not for the technologies he had created, not for the battles he had prevented, but for the simple truth he had understood before anyone else, that the universe is made of stories, and those who tell the best ones get to decide what reality becomes. The galaxy had laughed at human myths. Then 10,000 dreadnoughts had appeared above them, and the story went on forever. 50 years after the first Congress of Narrative Minds, a young human named Sophie Bennett stood at the edge of the observation deck aboard the newly commissioned Unity Station, the first truly interspecies habitat in galactic history. The station hung in the space between 3 solar systems, a neutral meeting ground where beings from every corner of the hegemony could gather, learn, and share their stories. Sophie was 23 years old, born into a galaxy that her grandparents would not have recognized. She had grown up reading about the old days, about the time before contact when humanity had been alone and afraid. She had studied the records of that pivotal moment when Commander Nathan Cole had stood before High Admiral Korath and revealed the existence of the Einherjar fleet. But those events seemed like ancient history to her, as distant and mythological as the very stories that had inspired the Pantheon project in the first place. Today, she was meeting her best friend, a Selenari named Crystal Resonance of Starlight, for their weekly storytelling session. It was a tradition they had begun in their first year at the Interspecies Academy, where young beings from across the galaxy came to learn about each other's cultures. Crystal was the granddaughter of Krista Voice of Morning, the very delegate who had spoken with Grace Sullivan at the first Congress. "You seem distracted today," Crystal observed, her form shimmering in the station's artificial sunlight. "Is something troubling you?" Sophie smiled. "Not troubled, just thinking about how much has changed. My grandmother used to tell me stories about growing up on Earth, about how people were afraid we would be conquered or destroyed. And now here we are, living alongside beings from 30 different species, and it all seems so normal." "Is that not a good thing?" Crystal asked. "It is," Sophie agreed. "It's wonderful. It's just that sometimes I wonder if we've forgotten what it took to get here. The fear, the determination, the impossible faith that our myths could become real. I read about it in history books, but I don't really feel it, you know." Crystal was quiet for a moment, her crystalline structure producing soft harmonic tones as she processed Sophie's words. "Among my people," she said finally, "we have a saying, memory is the bridge between what was and what will be. Your species gave us that concept, actually. Before humans, we thought of memory only as recording, as preservation. But you taught us that memory can also be inspiration." She moved closer, her form casting prismatic shadows across the deck. "The fear your ancestors felt, the faith they found, the myths they made real, these things are not gone. They live in you, and the very fact that you can stand here, a human among aliens, and call it normal. That normalcy is the greatest achievement of your species. It is the dream made flesh." Sophie considered this. "I never thought of it that way." "Few do," Crystal said. "It is the nature of successful revolutions that they become invisible. The extraordinary becomes ordinary, the impossible becomes routine, and yet the courage that made it possible remains, encoded in the very structure of the reality it created." They stood together, watching ships from a dozen different civilizations come and go, each one a testament to the power of imagination to reshape the cosmos. "Tell me a story," Crystal said suddenly. "One of the old ones from before contact, the kind your ancestors used to tell each other in the dark." Sophie thought for a moment. "There was a story my grandmother used to tell me," she began, "about a young girl who was lost in a forest full of monsters. She had nothing to defend herself with, no weapons, no armor, no magic. All she had was her voice and her wits." Crystal's harmonics shifted to a listening register. "Go on." "The monsters in the forest were ancient and terrible. They had devoured countless travelers before her, but this girl was different. Instead of running or fighting, she sat down and began to tell a story. She told the monsters about a world where they were not monsters at all, but guardians, where their strength was used to protect the weak instead of preying upon them. Sophie's voice grew softer, more intimate. At first, the monsters laughed at her. They mocked her foolishness, her naive faith in the power of words. But she kept telling her story night after night, and slowly something began to change. The monsters found themselves imagining the world she described. They found themselves wanting to live in it. And did they? Crystal asked. Yes, Sophie said. They became the guardians she had described. They protected the forest instead of terrorizing it. And the girl walked out unharmed, having transformed her enemies into allies through nothing but the power of her story. Crystal was silent for a long moment. That is the human myth, she said finally. The story that changed the galaxy. You faced the monsters of the void and told them a better story about themselves, and they believed you. We all believed, Sophie said. That's the secret, isn't it? It only works if everyone believes. Indeed, Crystal agreed. Faith is collaborative, it requires believers. They watched as a massive nebular vessel drifted past, its crew visible through transparent sections of its hull, vast, gaseous beings who had once seemed utterly alien and incomprehensible, now simply neighbors in a shared galactic community. My grandmother's grandmother was at the first Congress, Crystal said. She told our family what it was like to sing with humans for the first time. She said it was the moment when she understood that Selenari were not alone in the universe, not because other species existed, but because other species dreamed. Sophie nodded slowly. The Pantheon scientists used to say that every intelligent species tells stories because every intelligent species is trying to make sense of existence. The forms are different, but the impulse is the same. We all want to believe that our lives mean something. And do they? Crystal asked. They mean what we decide they mean, Sophie said. That's the real lesson of the Pantheon project. Not that myths can become reality, but that reality was always made of myths in the first place. The universe is a story we're all telling together. Crystal's form brightened, producing a cascade of colored light that was the Selenari equivalent of a smile. You humans, she said fondly. You make philosophers of us all, Sophie laughed. We try. Far below them, in the depths of Unity Station, the Pantheon Archive continued its eternal work. Every story ever told by every species in the hegemony was collected there, analyzed, cross-referenced, and preserved. Scholars from across the galaxy came to study the patterns that emerged when you could compare the myths of 100 different civilizations. What they found confirmed what the Pantheon scientists had always suspected, that certain stories were universal. Every species had tales of heroes who faced impossible odds. Every species had myths about love and sacrifice, about death and rebirth, about the struggle between order and chaos. The details varied endlessly, but the underlying themes were constant. This was the foundation of the Universal Story Project, the Pantheon's current focus. If certain narratives were truly universal, if they emerged independently in every civilization that achieved intelligence, then they must reflect something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself. The project aimed to identify these core narratives and use them to create a new kind of communication, one that could speak directly to the storytelling instinct that all intelligent beings shared. The implications were staggering. If successful, the project would allow instant, perfect understanding between any two minds, regardless of species. It would be the final bridge, the last barrier overcome, the completion of everything humanity had been working toward since the moment they first looked at the stars and wondered what might be out there. Sophie didn't know much about the technical details of the project. That was far above her clearance level. But she knew it existed, and she knew what it represented. The dream of true understanding, the myth of connection made real. She also knew that it might take centuries more to complete, perhaps longer. Some problems, it seemed, were too vast even for mythopoetic engineering to solve quickly. But that was all right. Humans had never been in a hurry. They had spent 100,000 years learning to dream. They could spend a few more centuries making those dreams come true. I should go, Crystal said, her harmonics shifting to indicate time awareness. I have a resonance session with the Arborean delegates. They're teaching us their world dreams. The ones where entire forests share a single story. Yes, it's fascinating. They experience narrative in a way no other species does, spread across thousands of individual organisms, each one contributing a small piece to a vast collective tale. They say it's like being a single word in an infinite poem. Sophie smiled. That sounds beautiful. It is, Crystal agreed, and terrifying and wonderful. All at once, she paused. That's another thing you humans taught us, that the best stories make you feel everything at once. Joy and sorrow, hope and fear, the full spectrum of consciousness engaged completely. We call that catharsis, Sophie said, the purification that comes from fully experiencing your emotions. Yes, we have adopted the term. Crystal began to move away, her form trailing prismatic light. Same time next week. Same time next week, Sophie confirmed. And Crystal, tell the Arborans I said hello, and that I'd love to experience a world dream sometime if they're willing to share. I will tell them, Crystal promised. They will be pleased. They have many stories about forests that learn to speak and humans who learn to listen. She departed, leaving Sophie alone on the observation deck with the stars and her thoughts. Somewhere out there, the Einher, our fleet, was still patrolling. The ancient warriors, restored from death to eternal service, continued their vigil over the civilization that their sacrifice had helped to build. They were living myths, walking stories, proof that the impossible could become real if you believed hard enough. But Sophie understood now that they were not the true legacy of the Pantheon project. The true legacy was the galaxy itself, transformed, unified, driven by a shared conviction that stories mattered, that imagination had power, that the things we choose to believe can become the things we achieve. The galaxy had laughed at human myths. Then 10,000 dreadnoughts had appeared above them. And now, 50 years later, a young human and a crystalline alien could stand together and share stories like the oldest friends in the universe. That, Sophie thought, was the best story of all. The story that was still being written, the story that would never end.